Dogworks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dogworks. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com. You can support this podcast on patreon.com/firstpawmedia.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Robert Forto and you're listening to our continued Iditarod coverage here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley, and RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site. You can find more information about us on dogworksradio.com, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. I know several of you have indicated that you have. We really appreciate that, and then let us know where you're listening from. Maybe let us know in the comments. And I am joined today by my co-host Toni Reitter, calling in from Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. Toni, how's it going?
Pretty good. It stopped raining, so I'm hopeful that we won't have any more nasty weather for the rest of the weekend.
Yes, and hopefully it has died down a little bit on the Iditarod Trail as well. I know it's been a real slog with all of the snow and warm temperatures and all that, and we're going to have a little bit more on that in one of our stories this evening about the bug that is going through the dogs, the stomach bug. But before that, we currently have 47 people on the trail. It looks like at the last time I refreshed, Brent Sass, Dallas Seavey, Hugh Neff, Jesse Holmes, and Richie Deal are the top 5. And bringing up the back of the pack are Kaylin Davis, Lisbeth Norris, Yuka Honda, and Julie Erhen, I believe is how you say it. And it looks like everybody has taken their 24s, so we don't have any scratches or withdrawals, but you do have a potential update on Julie. What do you know?
Well, Julie left McGrath late last night, I think, or early this morning. Early this morning. And she took off, and then if you have GPS tracker, you're able to rewatch certain parts. You can go back in time, basically, and rewatch the little flag moving. And even though the tracker is very glitchy this year, it looks like Julie had some trouble. She was backtracking quite a bit on the trail and then decided to go back to McGrath. Now, we haven't heard anything it's past 12 hours now from when she left McGrath. So I don't want to speculate as to what happened or what is going to happen. But typically in this race, when you see something like that and it's a long rest, it could mean that a scratch is coming. That being said, we've seen other mushers where they just sit in one spot for a couple of days. They talk themselves through it. They've got the race marshal talking them through it, and then they continue on down the trail. But with her sitting in McGrath with nobody else around, that's going to get harder and harder for her to do. If she doesn't get moving, the officials may ask her to scratch, or they will withdraw her just because they want to keep moving the race forward and close up shop so that they can continue on down the trail.
And that is what I call the Iditarod machine, and there is a specific rule with that. I believe it's called Rule 36. Is that right, Toni?
Something like that. Yeah, it's basically the stay competitive rule.
And, in some Iditarods, they have been real sticklers with that rule. I remember several years ago where they called a guy and he says, "Nope, I'm not doing it. I'm going to continue on." And he continued mushing on, and it caused a real hubbub. I think people were even sued and all sorts of things over it. And then other years they're a little bit lax on it, and they don't enforce it as much as they have in the past. So it would be interesting to see how it plays out in this year's race. It is a big time competitive rule in terms of all of the rules that are in the handbook, if you will, which brings us to our next story, and possibly what is going on with Julie is there's been a stomach bug with the dogs along the trail, and this happens almost every year. It happens in almost every sled dog race, because anytime, just like when you have a gaggle of kindergartens that are meeting up for school, you're going to have bugs and things going around. And of course, we know all about that with COVID over the last couple of years, but this happens almost always on a sled dog race. What do you know about the current stomach bug here on this race?
For the most part, it sounds like it's a very quick and over stomach bug. It seems like even teams like Dallas Seavey, who I don't know have the stomach bug, but he didn't like how his dogs were eating before he left Cripple, and now they seem to be doing better. But you have mushers like Jeff Dieter and Riley Deitch, who said today that, their dogs have been pretty finicky up till now. And it sounds a lot like it's mainly due to the stress of it being warmer temperatures while they're running. And so they're not eating because they're hot and tired, but they're also not eating because they just don't feel good. And like you said, it's like a kindergarten class, or anytime kids go back to school, everybody shares their germs, even though these dogs are vaccinated for most of the common strains of doggy flu and everything else. There's always a germ that's going to get through, and they're going to pass it around as they mingle with each other in the different checkpoints and on the trail.
And most folks don't know that the drop bags for Iditarod are required to be turned in usually around mid to late February, a couple of weeks before the race. And they do their best to keep things frozen. Oftentimes, if winter weather cooperates, they will just leave the drop bags outside, because obviously if it's 20 below zero, you don't have to worry about freezing 500 drop bags at a checkpoint. You can easily just let them be there. But when we have warmer temperatures like this year, it is pretty easy for things to thaw out, especially smaller dog snacks and things like that. And of course, anybody that's ever eaten anything that soured, we know exactly what happens to our bodies when that happens.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about the dropped dog program, or return dog program, as they changed the name just a few years ago from pressure from quote unquote the dark side, when they said, oh, it means something more than it is, but that's not necessarily the case. So the way it typically works is teams start out with a group of dogs. They recently changed it from 16 dogs to 14 dogs. And then along the trail, dogs are dropped out of the team for numerous reasons. It could be a sore paw, a stomach bug, a sore shoulder, a dog that isn't pulling well, a dog that's only part of the race for a specific reason, as we mentioned a couple of nights ago. Some people have bigger dogs that they use in that first third of the race. Think about offensive linemen in football. And then those dogs are dropped out of the team, and the smaller dogs continue. Or dogs can get into fights, or all sorts of things. Dogs are going to be dogs. So at some point along the trail, they are returned back to Anchorage for, I think it's the first half of the race, and then on the other end of the race, I think once they reach the coast, they are flown to Nome, and they are corralled there until somebody that is representative of that team picks them up. Often it's handlers, husbands, wives, coworkers, whomever you can get on an emergency list to say, hey, will you do me a favor while I'm gone for 2 weeks and take care of my dogs while I'm gone? I've been in that boat, and I'm sure I can share a story or two once I get Toni's take on this, but it is a process that goes on all the time. When the dogs are on the trail, they are packed up and sent out on the next flight out, whether that be in a couple of hours or maybe in a day or so. And all of the dogs wear special tags that indicate who the musher is, what number the dog is on the team, and all of that. So they're checked out by the vets. They're placed on a plane. Sometimes they go from a smaller checkpoint to a larger checkpoint by snow machine. And, there's all sorts of working pieces to this. But eventually they make their way back either to Anchorage or to Nome. And then they're cared for by a group of volunteers. Sometimes it is a group of volunteers at the women's prison in Eagle River, which is about 15 miles or so from Anchorage, but it doesn't look like that's going on this year because of COVID. But often they are held at the return dog area, and then they are held there until one of these folks picks them up, and then often those folks take them back to their home kennel, or they become very quick foster sled dog owners until the owner gets back. Almost always, the dog that is returned is spry and ready to go before they get back to Anchorage. They're ready to be sled dogs again, as we saw with our infamous escapee just the other day, who said, hey, I feel great. I'm going to take off on a little run and enjoy the sights of Anchorage. So that's sort of how the dog drop process works. What else can you share, Toni?
I think you covered all of it. Yeah, this year, the prison is always such a great location. There's obviously fences and less opportunity for the dogs to get loose. For the most part, though, the dogs are taken care of 24/7 until they can be released to their people, whoever they may be. It used to be, since they were right there at Iditarod headquarters in Anchorage, it used to be that fans could go and not necessarily mingle with the dogs, but they could go up and take pictures and that sort of thing. That changed, I think, around 2017 after the concern of tampering became a big deal because of the Musher X fiasco, which we don't have time to get into again. But other than that, it's always, I always feel bad for the dogs that are returned, not because, they're in bad shape or anything. Most of the time they're just happy-go-lucky dogs wondering why they're in a strange location. But for the most part, they're just sitting there going, how come I didn't get to keep going? So, I have a soft spot for the return dogs.
Yeah, and I know that's a real coveted volunteer position, and folks are always chomping at the bit to get one of those positions. As a volunteer for many years, this is sort of off subject topic, but how do you pick where you want to volunteer? Is there like a checklist that you can check off of first choice, second choice, third choice, or do they just place you somewhere, and then once you're sort of in the game, you can kind of maneuver around where you want?
Yes. No, when you sign up, it's a checklist. You get to, say, they've got a number on the list and you go your first choice, second choice, third choice, how you want to do it. You give them the dates that you're available. They do give priority to those that pay the ITC membership dues. And there are certain volunteer categories that you have to be an ITC member to be able to do it. And that's normally the ones that are going out onto the trail because of liability and vetting processes. They definitely want to make sure that you're covered if anything should go awry. But yeah, it's actually really easy. Once you start volunteering, you are you've been trained, you've had experience. So they definitely want to see you return in most cases. And so it helps. And if you're still around, you're done with a job, but you still got time and they need help, they may call you over. I started one year doing a merchandise table, and they always tried to get me to come into comms or the phone room to help out, and I just never had the time to do it when they asked me to join them. So it's a pretty easy process, and you can typically get into just about any job that you want. The only ones that are really hard to get are the ones that go out on the trail.
Right. And back to our return dog process. As I mentioned, you have to start you can start the race with 14 dogs currently. That's in the rules, but you have to finish with 5 dogs in harness. And does that mean, and I'm always unsure about this rule, does that mean all those dogs have to be running, or can they have 5 dogs and one of those dogs can be in the sled bag?
They have to be running. They have to be attached to the sled, not in the sled, for it to count at the finish line.
So 5 dogs in harness. So that means realistically that you can drop 9 dogs along the trail. And this often is a point of strategy for a lot of mushers. I know that Dallas Seavey is notorious for this. As he gets closer and closer towards the finish, he will drop a bunch of dogs and stick with a core set of dogs. And from a musher's perspective, this makes a lot of sense. It's a heck of a lot easier to care for 6 dogs than it is 12 dogs. And just some quick Iditarod math, it may take you an hour and 15 minutes to care for a team of 12 dogs. By the time you feed and booty and massage and ointment and all that, that could be realistically cut into half or 3/4 by only having 6 dogs on your team. But the strategy part of that is if you drop all of your dogs and then 1 or 2 become injured in those last couple of checkpoints, you may jeopardize your race. So it is a big time strategy point to make sure you know what dogs to send home and what dogs to keep on your team. There have been very few occasions where teams have finished with all of their dogs. That's a big deal in the mushing circles to be able to finish with a full string of dogs. I remember just a few times when we had 16 dogs finished with all of their dogs. I believe the last person to do that was Jessie Royer. Am I mistaken?
Mm-hmm. Nope, she was the last one, and I believe she was the first one in the top 10 to do it.
Wow.
Jeff King, I believe, has done it as well, but he did not finish quite so high. But Jessie is definitely the highest placing full 16 dog or 14 dog team it would be now. But all of the dogs, and I think she came in third that year, 3rd or 4th. Right.
And my little bit of a story about my experience with the return dog program. Several years ago, I was myself and my wife, Michelle, were the designated contacts for Hugh Neff's dogs. And I tell you what, Toni, it went on for the entire time he was on the race. They would call us up at 3:00 in the afternoon and say, hey, we have one of Hugh Neff's dogs here. So we would get in the car. We live in Willow, so 65 miles, hour and a half. We would pick up that dog, bring him all the way back, and almost inevitably, they would call us back the next day. Hey, we have another one of Hugh Neff's dogs. You need to come then pick them up. And it just sort of went on. I bet we drove 500 miles that year just picking up dropped dogs, and we probably had 7 or 8 of them by the time that he was finished, which is the last part of this story. Oftentimes when a musher finishes in Nome, they have a dog lot there where they can take care of the dogs, or they can stay there for a few days. But most mushers will send their dogs home early, especially if they finish way ahead of time of the banquet. Think of the top 5, top 10, whomever. They will often send their entire team home by the time that the banquet, or by the time they get home. That is a pretty common occurrence, isn't it?
It is, yeah, except for, the champion, typically his dogs win the golden harness. So a couple of his dogs, or her dogs, have to stay.
Right.
But for the most part, yeah, they try to get them out as soon as possible because even though the dog lot is relatively a good size. It's the parking lot next to the community center there in Nome. And it's buffered by the wind. It's actually a really well protected dog lot. It's still, if you have 40 teams and even if you're averaging 6 to 8 dogs a team at that point, which I don't think that is the average, but that's a lot of dogs in a relatively small space. They're there on their gang line. They're not like they would be in a normal dog yard with their dog houses and stuff. They're using their little cargo carrier out there. So they want to get them home. They want to get them comfortable, or at least if they're not going home because of, logistics or whatever, they're at least going to be in a dog yard that's a little more familiar than a very busy downtown street, So they do try to get them home and get them bedded down that way.
And way back in the day, several of the mushers would get to Nome with their dog team. And remember, it was a much different scenario back then. It was more of a camping trip. Several mushers back in the day would get to Nome, and then they would turn around and head back with the same dogs that they ran the entire race with. And that was a pretty common occurrence back in the 70s. And man, those are the old days. I don't think we'll ever see anything like that again. I know a few years ago, there was a team or two that finished Iditarod and then worked their way north and did other races, and then, of course, did the Kobuk 440, which is in early April. That's pretty common, isn't it?
I'm not sure how common it is, but I think with the teams we're talking about are the family of the Reitters, and APEC is running again this year. But they and their dad ran, and I think they did the Kobuk, and then they ran the Arctic Circle or ran home or some full circle thing that was really cool. And you kind of wish they still had the trackers so you could follow them on their journey. But it's a really neat thing. We've had mushers go from mile 0 of the historic trail up to Anchorage to start the race. So the musher, you guys are just weird. I don't know. There's adventure, and then there's what mushers do.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely a different animal for sure. So, folks, most of our mushers are on or near the Yukon right now. They will stay on the Yukon until they hang a corner there at the Kaltag Passage, as they call it, or Kaltag Portage, Kaltag Passage, which is a tough stretch of trail there. And then tomorrow we're going to pick up on our checkpoints. We left off the last couple of days because we didn't have enough checkpoints to talk about 1 or 2 or 3 every day. And there's some interesting stories with some of the checkpoints that are coming up, probably starting tomorrow or the next day with Kaltag, Shaktoolik, Unalakleet, Koyuk, and on. There's a lot of mushing lore in those checkpoints there. So, Toni, anything else before we jump over to our musher of the day?
I think we got everything. We mentioned Jimbo was found. So I think we've got everything.
So tonight, our musher profile is Bridget Watkins, and we talked about her a little bit last night. She is the daughter of Alan Moore, stepdaughter of Ali Zirkle. Am I correct on that?
You are correct, yep.
So start us off. What do you know about Bridget?
Well, she's bib number 36 here in the race. She grew up, of course, with a dad who loved sled dog races and all of that. So she did grow up a little bit with a kennel. She's a wife and mom to boys. So good for her. Good luck to her as they turn into teenagers. And she's started her own kennel. For a long time, she did a lot of support for Alan and Allie. But now she's branched out on her own. Some of the dogs that are in her kennel, of course, come from SP Kennel there in Two Rivers, I believe is where they're from. But she's got her own kennel program going. She's got great mentors in both Alan and Allie. she is the one, if fans have been following along with the mushing drama of the entire training season, Bridget just a few weeks ago had a very traumatic experience on a training run when a moose jumped into her team and basically would not let her team go. It trampled several dogs to where they had massive injuries. No dogs thankfully passed away, but it was kind of touch and go for one of them at least. They're all on the mend. Whether or not some of them will get to run again is iffy, but it's really not the most important thing. The most important thing is the dog is happy and healthy at the end of the day and recovers well. But that was something that she was concerned about coming into the race as well. And one of the photographers out on the trail actually shared a story on Facebook last night saying I believe it was coming out of McGrath, and the photographer had set up to take pictures, and because she knew Bridget was coming, and no Bridget. Finally, she finds the dog team, and come to find out there was a moose just hanging out really close to the photographer, and Bridget and the dogs had seen it, and they weren't going any further. They were going to wait until the moose walked off and walked on. And so, just for that, I think that's a huge thing for Bridget to overcome. We've heard a lot about moose on the trail and bison on the trail, and I'm sure that has made the first leg of her journey very difficult. She's also one of the few mushers running in this race wearing a helmet, which when she ran out of Willow, my dad was like, oh, of course she is. She's a nurse. She understands head injuries. And I just nodded and smiled and went, yeah, that makes sense. And it hit me like the next day. It also has a lot to do, I'm sure, with Allie's injury last year. So she's taking it very seriously. She believes in safety. She wants to get her team and herself happy and healthy down the trail.
Yeah, and back to that moose encounter several weeks ago. It was right around the middle of January, early February when that happened. Mm-hmm. Now, is that the one with that infamous now picture of the dog team, the moose in the middle of the dog team, and you have that one dog sort of almost smiling at the camera at the time of the photo? Is that the photo I'm thinking of?
I'm not sure if it is. For me, what I remember is just seeing that moose's ears flat back. I've watched a friend get trampled by a moose, so I'm sitting there. I have a little bit of trauma going on when I'm just looking at those pictures. But yeah, I think it might be because the moose is standing over her dog team, and she has I think a snow machine between her and the moose. So there might have been a smiling dog, but all I saw was the Arctic murder pony causing murder all over the place.
Right. And you mentioned that Bridget is a nurse, and that's a pretty common profession on the Iditarod Trail. I can count 2 or 3 nurses, at least whom I know, that is their profession. We always have a doctor or 2 and a lawyer or somebody in that type of profession. Why do you think that is?
With those high-stress jobs, I think just having, not to say that mushing isn't stressful. I'm sure it is, especially financially, and having to keep all of those dogs well-fed, well-trained, health-wise and everything like that. But at the end of the day, I imagine that just hooking up a dog team, even a small one, and going out and just getting away from everything to de-stress, to decompress, has to be one of the most healing things, especially in the last few years for these doctors and nurses, where they've had to deal with so much stress and pressure and sadness over the pandemic, and frustration. Just to get away. I'm one of those introverted types that there are days when I do not see anybody or talk to anybody, and I call it my detoxing day. I just need to get away from all of that stimulation and stress and just be. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. And so I think mushing can be that kind of healing activity for a lot of people in all professions, but I'm sure in those high stress professions, something like dog mushing and cuddling puppies, that's always a healing bit of magic.
Yes, for sure. And you mentioned, Toni, that she, of course, has some dogs on her team from the SP kennel there. Do you know if she has any of the those core dogs that have become so famous on Allie's team in particular? She always, has such awesome stories about all of her dogs, and I just wonder if they've made any stories about any of those dogs in the coverage.
Well, I know one of the dogs that unfortunately didn't make the team because he was injured in the moose attack was one of Allie's dogs, I think from last year, if not last year, the year before. I haven't seen too much on information on which dogs may have come from that kennel. But yeah, I assume that there's got to be a few because every rookie takes a few veterans on the trail, whether they borrow them or, let somebody borrow their dog year previously just so that the dog had experience, so that somebody on the team knew where they were going and what to expect. So yeah, I haven't heard which dogs from SC made the cut, but I know that they've definitely been part of the training program.
So there you have it, guys. Bridget Watkins is our musher profile of the evening, and tomorrow it is my chance to pick, and this happens to be my wife Michelle's dark horse. He is one of our neighbors. He mushes on our trails here on the east side of the Parks Highway. His name is Matt Failer. I'm looking forward to talking about Matt. I'm sure you have a bunch of stories to tell about him. He is one of the more popular mushers, but he's not as well known as the big names when we think of Seavey and King and Booser and those types. But he is always a contender, isn't he?
He is, yeah, and one of his mentors is one of those big names. He's been with Martin Boozer for quite a few years and then branched out on his own. So I'm excited to talk about Matt. I'm always excited to talk about Matt.
There you go. And also tomorrow we were asked on Twitter if we could talk about the veterinary program that they do on the Iditarod Trail. And I'm sure I have a story or two, and I'm sure Toni can share some insight. I know that she is pretty close with what's happening on the trail with the Insider and what's going on at those checkpoints and potentially what they do with the dogs at the vet checks and all of that. So that will be an exciting topic to talk about as well. So there you go, guys. If you do ask for topics or ideas, there's a pretty good chance we'll talk about it right here on the show. I think every night we've been influenced by at least a question or a comment from one of our social media followers. So if you're wanting to keep up with us, follow us on social media. We can be reached at Dogworks Radio on all of our profiles, so Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. I can be reached at Robert Forto on all of the platforms, and the last name is Forto. And Toni, how can folks reach you?
They can find me on Twitter at Toni Shell AK. That's ToniChellEak. Otherwise, on Facebook and Instagram, you can just drop the AK, and I'm just Toni Shell on there. And I'm always up to chatting on social media.
And I know that your blog has been shared far and wide on a lot of the Facebook pages recently, especially with your musher list. And that is a pretty impressive list with a bunch of links. How do folks find that?
It's tonishell.blogspot.com. I really do need to get its own domain name, but I'm too cheap.
It's only $10 and then probably $5 a month to host it yourself. So it's not a big deal. And I could probably help you out with that if you need to down the line. So with that, guys, that is our show for the night. We're making the turn into week number 2 starting tomorrow. As we know, the ceremonial start was a week ago last Saturday. So we're on the home stretch, as they say, and we could potentially have a winner very early next week. And I remember something that Toni said 3 or 4 days ago when she said that the first person into McGrath almost always is not the winner of Iditarod. Is that still your vote?
Well, Aaron Burmeister is really not up there in the chase pack right now, but I'm not counting him out yet, especially since I jinxed him by picking him to be my winner.
So we'll see how it pans out. Of course, there's a lot of people cheering for Brent Sass up there, and we'll see if he can pull it off. And for folks remember in my picks way back last Friday, I said that Brent was going to win. So we'll see what happens and where our picks line out over the next few days. On behalf of my co-host Toni, this is Robert for Mushing Radio. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Goodbye.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio.
So earlier, you learned about First Paw Coffee Company. Now I'm going to tell you about its Trailbreaker Blend. First Paw Coffee Company's Trailbreaker Blend is inspired by our love of the Northern Lights, frosty paws, and sled dog trails. How cool is that? The Trailbreaker Blend is a private label premium blend that was developed just for them. It's a medium dark roast from Central and South America, highlighting flavors of brown sugar, hazelnut, and plum. Be sure to go to ak.dog/free and enter to win a bunch of cool prizes. That's ak.dog/free.